Welcome back to another JJ in the Field. Timely agronomic tips when you need them most. I'm your host, Jonah Johnson. Well, we finally made it through the cold spells. We are now in the middle of the summer 2021, and I am in a soybean field, and things are finally starting to take off. Now, if you think back over the last couple months, unfortunately we've experienced quite some ups and downs in our growing season, which were very much unexpected for us here in Ohio. So you think about, we started off planting in April. We had some really nice conditions up in the 70s and 80s, dry. A lot of acres went in. Then the end of April, we hit a cold snap and got, unexpectedly cold for the season out of the year. Then things improved through May, and we got into May and things were just rocking and rolling again. Then at the end of May, we had quite a severe cold snap. So if you think back, we even had a couple days of snow. Up in northern Ohio, we actually had a little bit of accumulation there. And so what was concerning there is where we had either plants that were in the ground imbibing cold water for the first time, or we had very young tender plants that had a very cold air temperature that translated into some cold soil temperatures as well. So for everybody out there that's has beans they're not as excited about, talking to a lot of other agronomists across the Corn Belt, and some of our own assumptions here within Sunrise is that cold did a lot more to the physiology of these plants than we probably are actually aware of. And so everywhere that had, of course there's certain time zones through the months where guys planted and their beans look great, they're tall where they should be at this time. But behind me, to the side of me here, we're in 30-inch row beans. They look really good, but right now we'd expect them to be much further along, so that's not uncommon. So what I wanted to talk about today is that we're in the middle of July and we're starting to finally see some sudden death syndrome show up. So sudden death syndrome disease, the fungus is in the Fusarium family, Fusarium virguliforme, and so this pathogen unfortunately affects our soybeans very young, so anywhere from emergence up to that V3, that third trifoliate stage. And unfortunately we don't see that visual infection or that scorching of the leaves till usually in mid to late August. And so we've already been seeing walking fields here this summer and showing sudden death syndrome showing up early. And so I'm not really surprised from that. So if you think about that depending on when we planted, wet and cold, maybe you have a history of that in your soils, and so that makes sense to be seeing it. And now we're kind of in a dry spell, and so if those plants are starting to be stressed, that seems to make sense. Rather unusual for us here in Ohio this early, but not surprised considering the environment we had. So a little bit about SDS. Again, it infects those plants early. And then the soil conditions can harbor spores, and so once those sudden death syndrome, that Fusarium spores are in the soil, it resides there for a very long time. So many of you know, if you have those spots in fields that historically have had it, and you try to manage it either culturally, mechanically, or some type of chemical like a seed treatment, which we have now to hopefully battle that, tethered with varieties that we know that may have some resistance or be able to deal with sudden death better than other varieties here in Ohio. And so typically to tell if it is SDS, another disease that could look like is brown stem rot. They have the very similar where you have the yellowing inside of the veins, and eventually that turns brown and the tissue falls out. We call that the leaf scorching. And typically once that gets really bad, then you start to see pockets in fields that get worse and worse and worse. And that's why this is, next to Phytophthora, probably one of the most taxing diseases that we fight here in Ohio, especially since once we see it, we can't do anything about it. Things that we can do with it, obviously seed treatments is probably our best route versus looking at cultural practices of either planting later or strictly residing, trying to fight off soybean cyst nematode, keeping those under wrap, if you will. And then of course rotation helps to a point in fields, but anywhere where we've had historical long-term soybean stands, especially like in the deep southern Ohio, they battle this every year. So one thing, the way that we can kind of help predict this now, there's a new novel soil test available, and one of the labs we work with, SureTech Labs in Indianapolis, Indiana, has a soil test that is very similar to your fertility test. And actually, if you're having fields soil sample, we can denote those samples where we want to collect for the sudden death spore count. It's a DNA soil test that they do in a lab that SureTech partners with and can give back results. And when you get those results back, it can essentially tell you what your load is in your soil. So that can actually give you a great indicator, kind of a proverbial dipstick in the soil to let you know, do I have the pressure, and should I make management practices for the following year to address that potential. So obviously heavy weather impacted by this disease is, whether or not we have the conditions to suit that. So to tell the difference, if you're out there looking in your field and you start to see some senescence or yellowing in the field, we need to split those stems. And when you split those stems in half, if the centers is like a chocolate brown pith, and we know that, and you're seeing that leaf scorching, that's typically brown stem rot. If that split stem in half has a white center pith but gray on both sides of that, kind of like a piece of pipe cut in half, that's pretty indicative of sudden death syndrome. Now, can we have both? And the answer is yes, but you can only know that for sure with a lab analysis. So, exciting things to know from the sampling side to give us an indicator whether or not we're going to have it in the future. So keep in mind, if you have sudden death this year, denote those areas, and that's something that can be sampled in the fall after you harvest, and we can get you some answers back to help you manage that hopefully in the coming years. So these spores don't go away, but there are practices we can do obviously to employ to help maybe beat this disease or suppress it even better than we have before. So if you have more further questions, follow up with your local ASA or anybody on the PCT team. I'm Jonah Johnson. Thanks for watching.